or 60 years. And if you have, as I do, and as everybody does, a smartphone or a tablet of any kind, you know that those things are actually not really made by the companies whose logos are on them. Those companies design them. They coordinate a vast ecosystem, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of companies, but the companies themselves don't actually make the product. And so what used to be really important was managing yourself. And what has become really important is managing the relationships you have with others. And so inside the company, the CEO can just say, hey, we're all going to this system, like it or not. Outside the company, you can't do that. And so in my many years working at IBM, and John's had the same experience at IBM, we got to see a lot of this sort of ERP top-down systems implementation. And what we realized was that as good as that was inside the company, there was no comparable set of tools that allowed many companies to work together without forcing a central authority over them until blockchain came along. Blockchain, I believe, that if you were to boil down everything that EY believes about blockchain and its value to the enterprise, is that we believe it will do for networks of companies what ERP did inside the single enterprise. And so when John came to me and started talking about this idea of teaming up together, he loved where we were going, and he had some other ideas to bring some other core capabilities from kind of enterprise technology into the picture. It really started to sort of ramp up and roll together. And so it's really been a privilege for the last 9 months to be working with Consensus, and especially with John's vision. And this is like an anniversary rematch of a conversation that we had a year ago where we were still starting to cook up some of these ideas, but they hadn't turned into a deep collaboration. So to kick off or to resume our anniversary rematch, I'm going to hand you over to John Wolpert, who's going to lead our Q&A and discussion. John, thanks for joining.
Yes, and thanks. I'm sorry I'm a little late. I was running the Baseline TS Technical Steering Committee call, and it ran just a little couple minutes over. And but I kind of knew that everyone would be well entertained by Mr. Brody. I remember the thing I remember most about that super fun fireside chat that we had.
That it was in person in New York and not over the video?
Yes, and it was, and it had way better drinks than I'm getting on these webinars of it. Somebody ought to have a webinar where you have a breakout and so they send around a cocktail recipe for everybody to make on their own before. So what I remember most about that was that, first of all, it was last minute. They were kind enough to give us that slot. And if we hadn't done that slot, all of this stuff might never have happened. So Travis, one of the organizers of Ethereal, sort of deserves a lot of credit for helping us get on matchmaking. But the other thing that was fun about it was that it was amazing to watch a 100-year-old accounting firm talk about using the mainnet, the public mainnet, in ways that you don't even hear some startups talking about. And so I was fascinated, and maybe we can talk more about that, right? About how this is the year where enterprise executives get to be safe, contemplating sensible uses of the public blockchain, right? What say you to that?
Well, I of course say yes, please. I mean, we've been trying to do that for some time, right? There's one of my colleagues, a very funny lady. She says, the reason why companies want to do business with EY, the reason why they want us to audit them is because if they work with us, they're less likely to go to prison. And people like me don't do very well in prison, but there's some truth to that, right? Which is, if you're a big accounting firm and you sign off on the audit of a blockchain-based company, right, you're giving an important seal of approval, and it's not arbitrarily given, by the way. Like, in order for us to get our accounting rules reviewed, we have a whole department called professional practice, and they basically say, can the company that we're auditing meet the same legal standards as our other clients who deal in regular currency in traditional bank accounts, right? Can they do their KYC? Can they do their AML? So the fact that we've been signing off on audits of companies in the cryptocurrency space, exchanges, asset holders, for more than 5 years now, is a really important thing, right? When people that we see all the time, our competitors going to clients and saying, oh, you should probably reconsider this whole public blockchain thing. It's risky, it's dangerous, there's criminal activity. You should know that stuff is nonsense, right? It's complete nonsense, because if it was true, then EY and Deloitte and KPMG and PwC wouldn't be routinely signing off on the financial audit statements of these companies. Now, that doesn't mean that everything that goes on the blockchain is good. And it absolutely, in the same way that everything on the internet, isn't necessarily good or legal. But for our clients, we know there is a way to do business safely, legally, without going to prison, using public blockchains and cryptocurrencies. And, this sort of myth of like, ooh, it's dangerous and scary is something that we just really have to work together to put to bed, because it's got no foundation in fact.
Say more about that. And Dror, I know, has a lot of thoughts about this. I know that Dror knows E&Y very well. What do you guys say? I mean, there are, you can do cash, you can do nefarious things with privacy, and cutting the difference or the balance with privacy and confidentiality, along with accountability and traceability and auditability, is it's a neat trick, right? Because everybody can be naked on a public beach and very very little secrets go on, but then there are problems with that. But then you can also be very confidential, very private. There are problems with that. How do you balance it out?
So our goal really is to develop the maximum level of privacy that's legally allowable. And in particular, we really have a benchmark that we're aiming for, which is, my goal isn't to help you keep your business transactions private or secret from the regulators. My goal is to make sure that you can conduct business transactions on the public Ethereum mainnet in a way that's fully regulatory compliant, but gives your competition no ability to learn about what you're doing. That's the priority for us, right? And so if you look, for example, at technology like Nightfall and now Nightlight, this is stuff that we developed over the last couple of years to really enable private transactions. The early versions enabled privacy, but they didn't fully support all the different types of regulatory rules. So now the newest version of Nightlight actually supports regulatory compliance. It supports whitelisting and blacklisting, so that companies that do KYC and AML can make sure that their transactions are only going to authorized parties, right? And it also supports our audit tools, so that if you're an enterprise and you're managing a class of assets and you need to be able to show where those are to a regulator, you can do that, but you can do that without ever risking that your client's private data becomes exposed. And that's I can't emphasize over and over again how important that is. There will be no enterprise participation on public blockchains without really robust privacy and security.
Dror, do you have anything to add there?
Now, Dror told me that he was going to stay out of this, and I worried that he might have meant that because he had gone to prison after a bad audit from EY. So maybe, Dror, I saw you went off mute, so please clarify that you didn't go to prison because of an EY audit.
I'm not in prison, but I'm behind the scene today, John. So go ahead. I'm a facilitator, the technical facilitator.
Well, my ignorance was amplified by the fact that I know you have a lot to say about this subject.
Correct. I will deal with other technical stuff. So go ahead, continue with the show.
Right on. So Paul, it strikes me when we met. I think that dialectic is a useful thing. When done with intellectual honesty. And, one of the dialectics we had was you were really and are really about tokens. I mean, you're big on tokens, about asset management, and I've been sort of carving out this sort of contrarian notion that, hey, let's think of the blockchain just as a bunch of as a place to put ones and zeros. It's just a state machine, right? And obviously these aren't too conflicting, but the focal points were different. And for me, it's quite easy if I'm just using the mainnet as a message bus or a piece of middleware to do that in such a way where there's no data on the blockchain and I've got lots of good privacy there. When you get to tokenization, you have to, what makes something a token? Let's start there. In your view, what are the attributes that make a piece of data somewhere into something you can call a token or a legitimate asset, digital asset?
So here you're probably getting a little bit into, let's call it, it could get very technical, and I'm not going to do that because I'm not the deepest technical person. When I think about tokens, the reason I'm big on tokenization is fundamentally blockchains were designed to buy and sell and transact around tokens, right? And so anything that I have, real or virtual, or that you have, can be turned into a digital token. And the reason for blending this idea of a message bus, right, which allows enterprises to keep their different systems in sync, right? And I don't think you really explained what a message bus is, but message bus is, and message queuing in the enterprise sense are all about keeping different systems in sync, right? So, chances are if you go to a large company and you try to change your address with them, your address is actually playing 20 different places. And so when you say, I want to change my address, I moved to a new location, there's some kind of message bus that's set up that's synchronizing that with 20 other systems, warehouse systems, inventory systems, e-commerce systems. They're trying to keep all that data in sync so that when you change your address, they send their junk mail to you at the right address. It sometimes has higher useful purposes as well. But fundamentally, kind of message buses are for synchronizing enterprise data and for making sure that stuff that happens on the left-hand side of the enterprise makes it to the right hand all the way, right? And you can use the blockchain as a message bus. But the reason to blend it with tokens is because it's really, in my mind, is all about, first, DeFi, but more broadly, decentralized systems, right? At the end of the day, if I am just dealing between two enterprises, if I have, I always like to say, if I have money and you have stuff and we're going to exchange them, I can do that without tokenization. But if my money for your stuff involves, say, 30-day payment terms, and the seller needs working capital, if I create the purchase order as a digital token and I can borrow against the value of that token, now I have more business flexibility. And so my goal is not just that we enable multi-company collaboration, but we also create this whole digital ecosystem, first of DeFi, which is maturing very nicely, but doesn't have privacy yet. And then secondly, we have DeFi, right, decentralized finance, but I think we need also DOps, decentralized operations. Why can't I tokenize available warehouse space and logistics capacity? And why can't I buy logistics capacity, warehouse space, 3D printer capacity, any of these things as operational assets and deploy them that way, right? You should be able to. So we should have DeFi, we should have DOps, and we also in the end should have decentralized systems, DSys, where, if I am a company that's really, really good at CRM, I ought to be able to effectively do your CRM for you in a way that's very simple. So my goal is, let's componentize the functions of the enterprise, and then let's make it possible, like with a set of Lego blocks, not just to assemble a physical supply chain, but also a technical, operational, and financial one.
That's great. You've gotten me excited about that. What is it? Let's take one of those. Let's take, so the first thing that we did with the baseline protocol was Radish 34. And Radish 34 is this really good example of the pattern that we did in supply chain management, right? And that involves right now a master service agreement, which is basically just a record using the blockchain to make sure that my record of the MSA and your record of the MSA is the same. It's never going to be an asset. It's not a token thing, or it's not an asset that you want to trade.
Generally speaking, MSAs are where we stick all of the flowery language about which court we will use and best effort and all the other stuff that's non-quantifiable in the normal course of business, right? It's the qualitative part of the contract, and so it's important to have a record that we both signed it, but it's not something I can tokenize, generally also because the sort of master contracts between the buyer and the seller are typically not they're not usually so commoditized that they're resaleable in that way. Right. Whereas a purchase order for a commodity is a token, is an asset that you could potentially resell and certainly should be able to borrow against.
And one of the components of an MSA is a rate table. So you could say that, here, and you can turn that into data. So here's my rate table that says if you go over 100 units in this period of time, I'm going to give you this much of a discount. And this was, as I recall, I remember the meeting. This was something that you were burning hot about. Was the problem with revenue recognition going from purchase orders that were coming in serially and hitting even modern ERP systems and SCM systems in such a way that you had to wait until long after invoices were cut to recognize revenue, because PO1 would hit the rate table at the, and PO2 would hit it and it wouldn't be updated, and they would both calculate from zero, and you would have the wrong discounting for one of them. And so what we did was show how using the mainnet and baseline pattern would prevent that from happening. You could potentially recognize revenue sooner, which I thought was pretty cool. But neither of those things is an asset. So those are just making sure records are ordered and consistent, right? And there's continuity. But,
right, there's assets, there's records, and then the rate table is business logic, and that's probably one of the trickiest parts of baseline.
That's right. And the coolest thing that I have to say, not to plug not to have shameless plugs for EY from over here, but I have to say it was breathtaking. They have a really, really excellent zero knowledge research department with Duncan and the team, and they created a custom Socrates circuit for the MSA rate table calculation, which was pretty cool. In a way, it reminded me of like the old days of Java and having Java interface classes that would enforce correctness on other functions. And I think it was kind of cool. But and I think there's a real opportunity, by the way, for standards bodies, auditors, and regulators to create libraries of these things to say, hey, as long as you guys are running through these circuits in a baselining way, your audit is going to be a lot less painful. We're going to be much more sure that you're doing things correctly without getting into your systems of record and having to examine you as deeply. I love that idea. I think
so. We certainly, if you talk to our auditors, right, our goal, is continuous, fully automated audit, right? No touch, continuous audit, and we're definitely not there yet. In part because the regulatory rules don't allow it. We could actually do it for some companies today, but the regulatory rules don't allow it. But I think we want to get to that point, and there's very few companies that, even if the rules did allow it, that could do so. But if you ran your entire company on the public Ethereum mainnet, we definitely could.
Right. And so I kind of like that, especially because, the regulatory, you don't want to have, if you can just say, look, there is no way this baseline proof could have shown up without them doing it according to the rules, where that's digitizable. I mean, some things are just human stuff. Like I always like to say the SEC regulation that, you might be able to audit some of that, like KYC and other things, but you can't really create a smart contract to prevent you from going on television and hawking your security as a get rich quick scheme, right? So you can't smart contract your way out of stupid, as I said, right? So but moving to the next thing, which is invoices, right? So the next thing after the PO is an invoice. And I know the baseline community, we were just talking today on the TSC call, the next shiny object is going and saying, okay, now I want a new workflow item. How can I make that easy? And that next workflow item in that particular flow is obviously the invoice. Now you have something that really is an asset. You can turn that into, you might call it asset management or digital asset management, or go all the way to calling it DeFi. But in that case, and then you could put that into something like, not to make another shameless plug, but something like Consensus Codify. At that point, it is an asset. And what would you say the attributes of that need to be to make it legitimately an asset? I mean, it's not just saying, okay, here's an ERC 721. What does it have to do to be a legitimate asset from an auditing company's perspective?
Okay, so now you're probably asking me to get into like some of the rules of audit, and that's That's not so easy for me because I'm not an auditor by profession, right? What I can say is, there's a set of rules for things, that in order to be verified as auditable. So if you say you own something, you have to be able to prove, for example, that it exists, right? That was, believe it or not, that was a major stumbling block early on with Bitcoin. Was like, so rule number one of an auditable asset is, does it exist? And does magic internet money exist? Right? You'll be pleased to know our auditors have finally come down on the answer, which is definitely yes. But that was an interesting
headlines. Yeah, E&Y proclaims that digital money does exist.
Right, and early on, people were like, well, how do we prove that it exists? And it turns out there are ways to sort of prove that entirely intangible things exist, and we applied some of those things. But it is possible. Occasionally, I do feel like we're discussing how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. Right? It becomes almost silly. What does matter, though, I think in the context of something like an invoice. So, if you think about it, right, I have money, you have stuff, right? I give you the stuff, right? And then I send you an invoice. So I've given you the stuff and I've sent you an invoice and you need to pay that invoice. So in this process, a couple of things. Number one, can we all agree the stuff exists? That's usually relatively straightforward, especially if we're buying actual product. I think the challenge with invoices is, as long as the invoice is between you and I, we can both agree that invoices, if it was for $100, it's worth $100. But if we want the DeFi community to get involved, and I want to factor my receivable, so I need to get paid now, and your terms are net 30 or net 60 or something, right? So then the question is, and this is where I think we start to hit some very important challenges. How can I know, without knowing very much detail about who you are or what we exchange, how can I, under very high standard of privacy, get a financing or an immediate payment on my receivable so that I know, so that other what is it I need to tell other parties about your payment history or my reliability as a supplier that they need to know in order to give me the difference, good data is the difference between me getting $99 now for my $100 invoice or 90 or 70, right? And so I'm less concerned about, is the invoice an asset and how do I prove its value? I'm much more concerned about this issue going forward of, if I want to create a true ecosystem, how much information and in what way does it have to be disclosed for it to actually be useful to a broader DeFi community?
Right, and by the way, that was what I was fishing for. Was at a high level, it needs to exist, and I think I might extend to say, would you not say that you need to be free of repudiation risk, right? That both parties know that that there's that one party can't say I didn't get the memo, and that you have verification that the events happened correctly, right? So, for example, I gave you stuff. You're giving me an invoice, or I gave you an invoice. You got the stuff. There needs to be. You need to be able to say, you're not going to come later and say, no, I never got that stuff. Right? There needs to be. If it wouldn't be nice if the invoice couldn't have been generated unless the stuff was verifiably, received.
Yes, and importantly, the invoice is mathematically provably correct, right? So in other words, we can't debate about whether or not you calculated it incorrectly.
Right. And you can't debate that maybe you didn't receive it, but somebody in your company hit the button that said you received it.
Right.
And you can't say that didn't happen.
You can't say that didn't happen. I want to be careful not to get sucked into one of these debates about transaction finality, because I occasionally, we talk to somebody who says, well, we can never really use Ethereum because it doesn't meet our impossibly perfect standard of transaction finality, or the system itself is not entirely perfect. And I can think of, a certain corner case. And when people say this, they're often speaking as if Ethereum is supposed to be some kind of real-time, Wall Street-like trading system. And I think that they are holding it up to an impossible standard, especially early on. I think for the most part, right, if I care about doing things, we need to remember what the practical applications are of this, right? So if two companies are transacting, if you and I are transacting, right, the way that most non-financial enterprises transact with each other is that I have money, you have stuff, and we're transacting on net 30. And the 30 in the net 30 isn't milliseconds. I'm not trying to program trade here. The 30 is days, right? And we have a long we have a long relationship, by the way. We have usually, buyer and supplier have done business for years or decades, right? They don't resort to suing each other at the drop of a hat. And so this search for perfect transaction finality, sub-second completion, some kind of perfect mechanism for dispute resolution. If we are to wait for all of those things to happen, we would never use the Ethereum ecosystem. By the way, that would also be true of the internet, of mainframes, of any of these things, right? And so many of the objections that I hear to using blockchain, especially public blockchains, involve holding it to an impossible and unrealistic standard that we never held prior technology to.
Yeah, I've been arguing on Twitter with some of our mutual friends about
why argue on Twitter?
Why? Because we've made a secret pact to argue, so that because it's fun and entertaining. It's all just good fun. But mainly, this red herring keeps popping up about Ethereum or proof of work, and I'm like, yeah, but proof of stake and ETH 2, and they're like, that's not here yet, and I'm like, your thing wasn't here in 2015 either.
Right.
So,
people talk about Visa and MasterCard as if they have they emerged fully formed in 1965 with 20 million transactions a second, and anything less than that.
Look, I mean, let's just talk banking, right? The ugly truth is there are a lot of people in every bank who have who have access to the general ledger and can change a general ledger after the fact. According to a source that I won't name but is very respected, the regulators are estimating the fraud from changing stuff in arrears, changing a destination ACH number, is in the billions a month. So your bank ain't as final as you think it is, right? And so when you say, well, it takes a few blocks to become, sort of probabilistically final on Ethereum, I'm like, I think that's good enough for me, at least for what we're doing.
Right. Exactly. So we've got about 10 minutes left, I believe. Do we want to take any questions or gratuitous flattery from the audience? I'm always open about that. Or do you have any other topics you want to hit?
Well, I did want to make one of the things that I think is exciting is I'd love to see this happen. So OpsChain is your product in SCM, and I keep on having this image in my mind of a button on your SCM product that says, turn that invoice into a factor. And I know there's this company spun out of Consensus a little bit ago. Jason Jones is a really knowledgeable guy, and he was telling me about this new product that they've got where it's factoring and bundling and rating, but then the factors, these short-term debt instruments become, and this is the cool thing I hadn't never thought of before, become collateral in MakerDAO. So that now their thesis is that Maker and other stablecoins need more diversification, more different kinds of collateralization. And so imagine invoices, corporate invoices being a form of collateralization for this. I thought that was a fascinating idea. And to be able to go straight from OpsChain into a DeFi platform like that via, by basically taking your invoice baseline and shunting into that seemed like an exciting idea.
That's a key part of the design vision, and one of the reasons why we were so diligent, you and I, going together to all of the ecosystem companies, right? You've been shepherding this ecosystem along, and it's heavily populated by DeFi companies because at the end of the day, enterprises buying and selling from each other is a huge source of liquidity and transaction volume, and it kind of dwarfs in many ways what you can get from a similar number of consumers. Sign up one enterprise, and you could be talking about tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars in transactions. And so that offers a kind of a really big, sustainable, reliable source of investment.
Right on. We did have some questions, and I guess we're open for business on the questions. I'm looking down here, and Dora, maybe you can help us here.
So John, you have two areas of questions. First of all, maybe you can click on the Q&A.
Yeah, so I see one here, which is, except for the tech work, what else can be done to advance adoption, right? And I think, to me, the answer is, from a technology from a non-technology standpoint, the number one challenge that we come across over and over again is kind of comfort level, governance, and regulatory compliance, right? So making sure that enterprises understand how this works in a non-technical manner, right? Clearly documenting and managing the governance of these solutions as they get deployed, right? John's been doing a mountain of work that's all non-technical, which is really kind of trying to organize and manage the ecosystem and drive us all to a set of common goals. So those are certainly at the top of my mind. John, what thoughts do you have as well?
I'm reminded of 2015, Paul, where, famously you said blockchain 15 minutes too soon, and I got to say blockchain 25 minutes after, and history was written. There was this moment where nobody was allowed to say blockchain, very well. And then somebody went around going, Arvind Krishna, the CEO of IBM today, was very much behind this, saying, blockchain's not Bitcoin, and we would we all got to say that over and over again. That laid the foundation for executives who were only, executives are busy people. They can only pay attention to so much of the time. Blockchain was coming on, and their understanding of it was that blockchain was cryptocurrency, and cryptocurrency was creepy. And so that was their position on it, and we helped get them over that. And suddenly everybody now was like blockchain crazy. The mania occurred. It's kind of like my 3-year-old screaming in the background, which is the new normal, if you can hear that.
I'm getting a C in 5th grade English.
Right.
But I see another question here, which is, what's the opinion of what's our opinion of 3rd-generation protocols like Polkadot and Cosmos?
Before that, I'd just like to punchline that previous point before the screaming happened, and that is, I think we just need to kind of create a list. That's a list of notable, people standing up and saying, don't use Mainnet for everything because that's dumb, but use it for these things. It's safe and effective, and your CISO won't lose his mind or her mind on it, right? So I think that's one of the things we could just do is have a bunch of people stand up and say, it's time for us to get over the fear of this thing as long as we use it properly.
Well, I do wish, as it were, that more senior corporate executives would come out of the closet in support of the mainnet, right? It is ridiculous, the number of C-level executives at large companies who tell us behind closed doors that they are all in favor of the mainnet and they wish that they could get the rest of their company on board with it. And so
don't put your bank account and your password in a transaction on any blockchain, but you can use it for stuff, right? I mean,
yeah. So we've got a question here about Polkadot, Cosmos, and other kind of newer protocols. My sense about this is, and I often find myself alone in this. So there's a reason why my Twitter feed says rarely right but never in doubt. My instinct is good, better, worse, doesn't matter, isn't relevant, because what happens is the best technology never wins. It's the technology with the most adoption. And that's Ethereum. Ethereum has, the giant user base. Ethereum has the developers. As I've told many people who are working on Hyperledger in the corporate environment, in their dorm rooms, when they had dorm rooms, college students were not writing Hyperledger code, right? They were mining Bitcoin and writing Solidity. And that is what drives it, right? The truth is our operating systems that we use, whether it's iOS or Windows or Android, everybody can point to something way better and newer that just doesn't have the adoption. And so, I think what happens is, we could even think of a better way to do the internet if we started from scratch today, but we couldn't get everybody to agree upon it. And so fundamentally, what drives success in the market, I believe, is adoption. Now, I also have a rule of thumb, which I've formed based on looking at some historical data, which was nicely put together by a guy named Horace Didier. and he runs a website called Asymco, ASYMCO.com. And he put together a bunch of charts that showed the history of different PC operating systems, PC, desktop, mainframe, that kind of thing. And what was really brilliant about this data is what it shows is that at the beginning of any new ecosystem, there's this incredible explosion of operating systems. So there'll be one that's new, right? It kind of kicks off the PC era or the mobile era or something, and there'll be this kind of Cambrian explosion of dozens of different choices. But what happens is within about 10 years, actually almost always within 10 years, the winner is visible. And then what happens is new operating systems, product solutions continue to come to market, but they don't get enough traction. And my personal opinion is the fact is we are past the 10-year mark in the blockchain era, and I believe for better or for worse, the fact is that Ethereum is almost certainly going to be the winner, not because it's the best. And I will not get sucked into one of these flame wars about which one is better. It is going to be the most successful because it has the user momentum. And if you look at things like ETH 2.0, okay, yes, it's late and it's not as perfect as people had hoped, but ETH 2.0, in the same way that iOS and Windows and Android do, they absorb some of the cool ideas that get tested out in things like Polkadot and Cosmos and cutting-edge, mobile device operating systems, but they don't necessarily adopt them right away. And so I believe what we'll see is, yes, people will complain. 20 years from now, people are like, oh, Ethereum, it's so awful. I wish we could do something better. But the reality will be, I think we will probably all be using Ethereum.
I tend to agree. Honestly, I'm a partisan on this. And so what I like to say, and we've talked about this before, is that I've been flogging this notion of the capital M mainnet for the capital I internet, and that let's just find the job and then decide who the candidates for the job are. And to me, the job is I need the last silo. Right? We've got all these silos out there, and very often you need a silo before the last silo. You need something that has higher performance or some other special characteristics, doing some gaming, doing something else. And there's going to be lots of different, as always there's lots of state machines for different things. At the end of the day, though, the novelty here is, the new thing is, we've got this final silo. It's always on. You can pay as you go. It can't lock you out from valid operations, and it resists being taken over by oligopolies or Dr. Evil in such a way that they could lock you out or change history, right? And I want all of those attributes, and I'm willing to give up some speed. There will never be a singleton, a single state machine that reads, and the physics of reads and writes are such that you're never going to have a world computer. You might have a world's computer, that is the internet's state service. I like that idea. But you're never going to happen. Even Cassandra, even with sharding, with no consensus, is not going to handle every single read and write in the world. Period. It's not going to happen. So the question is, what is the mainnet good for? And I think it's good for being that last silo. That gives lots of opportunity for other things, from Polkadot to Cosmos to Corda to what have you, to do what they do well. And when they need to avail themselves of the last silo, Ethereum is, right now, I can't see anything that has better attributes for that. And Brian Behlendorf, I know, has said more than once, I like that idea. I just want Ethereum to be more decentralized. And I say, great, let's get all of our friends in corporate, in the corporate world and governance to help make it more decentralized, right? Let's have self-identified miners and ultimately stakers that can enhance the confidence that we can have that Dr. Evil isn't taking the thing over.
Right. Very well. I see one more question here, which is I think it's a complaint. Only one T-shirt, and the answer is I can't do live video shirt changes because that would involve me bearing all for the online audience. So I think that takes us to our time. Does it not, John?
This is always so fun. I'm looking forward to next week. I think we're doing it again, and I love interviewing you. It's one of my favorite things.
Thank you very much. John, have a great day. Thanks for joining us. Dror, thanks for raising this. It's been a pleasure to be invited.
Thank you very much, guys, and have a great afternoon.